Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 21st of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak visiting Israel for talks with key leaders, Hamza Yousaf leading his first SNP conference whilst his in-laws are trapped in Gaza, and Greta Thunberg among 26 people charged in London after oil protests. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Jamie Timson and Harriet Marsden. Plus, we welcome back from the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast, Cindy Yu. Cindy, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that Kenya refused to tighten its belt?
For example, if you're going by economy at 1,000 shillings, it's so much cheaper as well. So all those compound together, so speed, safety, cost, all those come in, and it's very convenient for me.
So far, it's been quite good, actually. One, because it's quite convenient and comfortable and cost-effective.
Some passengers going from Nairobi to Mombasa there on the SGR train service being interviewed by CGTN Africa on Tuesday. And I should point out CGTN is a news service funded by the Chinese government, which is relevant, Cindy. Tell us why.
Yep, CGTN is the global arm of China's state broadcaster, and the reason they're covering this railway in Kenya is because it's part of their of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the Chinese are incredibly proud of the success there. The Belt and Road Initiative has been running for about 10 years now. It's racked up $1 trillion in investment, if you can believe that. And Kenya has been one of the major recipients and partners for that. And there's been some mixed success with that, because despite the happy people that CGTN is talking to in this interview, because of course CGTN would be picking the positive customers, this railway is actually meant to be going from Kenya to Uganda, and it's actually unfinished. So the Kenyan president this week is in Beijing to basically ask for $1 more billion in funding, even though this particular politician was very critical of the Belt and Road Initiative when he was in opposition just previously.
Yeah, this is William Ruto, the president of Kenya. So when he was getting elected, he was saying we're too reliant on the Chinese. Now he needs his railway finished. He's going to the Chinese for more money.
Absolutely. And this is already coming on top of $8 billion that the Kenyans owe China. So it's a lot of money to be asking for. And what I think is particularly interesting about this story is how it shows that Kenya actually doesn't really understand China. You know, we often say in the West that the West doesn't understand China, but actually it seems to me that Kenya doesn't really understand China from this instance, because the Chinese economy is doing so badly at the moment in the aftermath of 3 years of zero COVID that to go asking for $1 more billion, it's just not the right time for it. And I think it's unlikely that Beijing will say yes.
But I mean, Harriet, when China loans money to countries like Kenya, they do so on the basis of what's been called debt diplomacy, right? They get interest on these loans. They intend for these loans to be paid back. Why would that not appeal to the Chinese?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. Why would it not appeal to the Chinese? Well, there's been a lot of criticism over the Belt and Road Initiative, despite the fact that this week there's been this 10-year anniversary summit and lauding the praises of the Belt and Road Initiative. The fact is that various countries have really struggled to pay their debts to China, like Sri Lanka and Zambia. Cambodia is in real trouble as well. Half of their investments are Chinese, and there's all these unfinished projects, like this one that we're talking about in Kenya with this train line that ends in a field like 200 miles from the border with Uganda. So it's bad PR. There's a lot of criticism. Also, if you even if you get interest on the debts, if you can't pay the interest and you can't pay you're still losing money. You're losing a vast amount of money. As Cindy says, that's money that China can't necessarily afford to lose as much as it could before. Although news did come out yesterday that the Chinese economy actually grew 5% year on year in the third quarter, which is a lot higher than expected. And it's very close to their growth target, although obviously their growth target is lower than it's been for 20 years.
I mean, cynics would say, he says, turning to Jamie Timson, that the plan for the Belt and Road Initiative all along was, if you're being unkind, to extort money from the countries that can't pay their debts. So you get the short-term bonus of giving jobs to Chinese construction companies to build things like roads and railways. And then when they can't pay, you do get the interest off them. And actually, that was part of President Xi's plan with this all along. This is all going to plan.
Yeah, this idea of debt trap diplomacy, analysts have kind of wondered quite how true this is. I mean, a lot of the kind of, when it was coined in 2017, was about a port in Sri Lanka, which Chinese investment helped build, and then there wasn't much kind of economic gain for the country. So then instead of paying back the loans, the Sri Lankan government ended up giving over 70% of the ownership of the port to the Chinese government. In terms of what are the other options when you look at countries, the other option is maybe the IMF, which is often seen as the World Bank in terms of loans. But a lot of the time they weren't giving out money to these countries. A lot of the time they said that a lot of places like Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, they weren't willing to offer that kind of money. So where do these people go if they want to finance their initiatives, infrastructure? The Chinese were kind of the only game in town, even if it was a crooked game.
And they're also the experts, Cindy. I mean, why have these projects failed to generate the predicted income when they were analysed in advance and they said, yes, we can deliver this and we can deliver it for this money?
I think it's often a mixture of reasons because there's just so many projects that we're talking about here. Sometimes it's over-promising. So the Chinese companies saying, oh, yes, of course, we can do it for this extremely low price tag. But as is the way with infrastructure projects, even Chinese infrastructure projects, sometimes things go over budget or get delayed. And then the host country kind of lose interest or their governments change, which has happened often with European partners who are interested in Belt and Road Initiative stuff. Sometimes it's also just problems with getting local permits or anything like that. So there are lots of reasons for infrastructure projects not to go ahead. But also sometimes just the countries running out of money themselves, as this has been the case in Kenya. I was in reading up for this. In the last 3 years, actually, China has written off $79 billion of debt from the Belt and Road Initiative, written off or renegotiated. Now, that's a drop in the ocean for $1 trillion, but still a lot of money. And basically what's happened is that the creditor isn't as happy to give out that money in the recent years as there has been before. And so some projects are just left not finishing.
So what's the advantage then, Harriet? If they are losing some money, I mean, I presume it's partly, obviously, like I said, they get these construction contracts, but partly also, I suppose, just soft power around the world, countries that have a friendlier relationship with them.
Yeah, soft power and hard power too. I mean, she is still positioning the Belt and Road Initiative as kind of an alternative to Western globalization and the Western-led world order. So yeah, it's hard power and soft power. And obviously, as Cindy said, 79 billion is a lot of money, but it is a drop in the ocean for $1 trillion. We're talking about, I mean, this project has been signed up to by 145 countries. That's 3/4 of the world's population and half its wealth. It's not just soft power we're talking about. I mean, for every 1 or 2 or 3 projects that we can point to, like the unfinished tourist city in Cambodia or this railway in Kenya, we can point to 1,000 that have been finished, and we can point to many more that will be. But it's worth noting that Chinese lending hasn't been lower than this in 20 years. I mean, really, they're trying to move towards more sustainable projects and away from these big debt-fueled investments. And there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment around Chinese exports because of, the war between Israel and Hamas and deteriorating relationships with the US as well. But I think the overall point is just the world has changed unimaginably in the decade. I mean, China couldn't have seen the pandemic coming, and it couldn't have seen how badly the pandemic affected their GDP and how badly it affected their growth.
But still, it has left them, Jamie, with some interesting alliances, hasn't it? I saw that Pakistan has $27 billion worth of Belt and Road initiatives with the Chinese. So when you talk about world order, I suppose when it comes to decisions about the likes of Israel, Gaza, or Russia, Ukraine, or, of course, China, Taiwan, these are the things that people are going to be bearing in mind when they're casting their votes.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about on this podcast before about this new kind of the global South and the role that potentially it'll play in the future, and a kind of, as Harriet says, a kind of new world order in terms of moving away from the kind of Western-dominated, US-dominated. I think a good example is soybeans. So China is the world's biggest importer of soybeans, which it used to rely heavily on the US for, but now it relies on Brazil. And Brazil are estimated to be the region's largest recipient of the Belt and Road Initiative funding. So those kind of links that perhaps didn't really exist before do then move forward into, like you say, soft power and questions about their global standing. I think it's very easy, from this discussion and other ones that I've read, I think it's very easy to kind of look at China and the kind of Belt and Road Initiative as from a Western perspective as being something that's quite negative and quite nefarious in terms of the conditions that they put on a lot of these loans. But actually, when you get into it, they have built a lot of things. They do have quite a lot of power and a kind of track record in building infrastructure, and so it's not like such a negative thing, I would say.
Well, indeed. And in China, Cindy, it is, as we've seen, being sold to the people as, A, look at how we're improving the world, and B, look at this positive story for our economy. Can that continue? You seem to be suggesting that it's under strain.
Yeah, I do think it is under strain. And actually, when you talk about the reaction to it in China, what's interesting is that as the Chinese economy gets worse, youth unemployment before they stopped publishing the figure was around 21%. So, the Chinese people are not getting jobs that they want. They're not getting the kind of salaries that they want, especially after zero COVID. Often, many of them have, used up all their savings or lost their jobs. So the difficulty with then the Chinese government saying, oh yes, we're going to give $1 billion to Kenya, is that it looks very bad to already struggling Chinese people. And that's a dynamic that you're finding on all struggling economies. But in China, there's no direct feedback loop for sure, that the people can't really exactly tell the government what exactly they think. But the government will bear that in mind, that there is a contingency of Chinese people who are like, hold on a minute, you keep putting all this money out, which is essentially aid, or at least it's cheap investment. What about us? What about our infrastructure? What about our jobs? And that kind of stuff. So I think that's also part of the reason why the government is winding down, as Harriet says, into more high quality, sustainable things, rather than just throwing money out there in the way that they were at the beginning of this project.
Okay, we're going to give the globe another spin with Harriet after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Harriet, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are Mexico's drug dealers going cold turkey on fentanyl?
For years, marijuana, heroin, and cocaine have all been produced and trafficked through this area. There's a heavy military presence, but the cartel is thriving thanks to a new product, fentanyl.
Guillermo Galdos, Latin America correspondent for Channel 4 News, in a video released back in May. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Harriet, what's happened this week?
So the Wall Street Journal reported on Monday that Mexico's biggest drug trafficking organization, which is the Sinaloa cartel, might be banning the production and the sale of fentanyl. And there's a lot of context to this. Earlier this month, there were billboards hung all over Culiacan, which is the capital city of the Sinaloa state, saying that fentanyl was banned, warning the citizens or the drug traffickers to stop distribution from the Chapitos, which is the most powerful gang in the cartel. Those are the sons of famous drug lord El Chapo. But the Sinaloa cartel was the biggest exporter of fentanyl to the US, but they've been saying that they're getting too much heat over the sale because it's becoming an increasing, devastating problem in the US and a sticking point in its relations with Mexico.
Okay, lots to unpick there, but just sort of to start with, Idiot's Guide, what is fentanyl?
Fentanyl's it's a synthetic opioid drug, and it's produced by taking opioid chemicals from China, mostly from China, and synthesized in these can be very makeshift, very lo-fi labs, mostly in Mexico. And it's unbelievably dangerous. It's so dangerous because it's so potent. It's also dangerous because it's so cheap and because it can be produced without any control and quickly and very much in a mass order.
Yeah, it's lethal at only 2 milligrams, Jamie. Why, if, you were a drug dealer or a gangster, would you want that product to be in your product? You don't want your customers to die. You just want them to be addicted.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and there was a great podcast called Search Engine just about this exact question about why drug dealers are cutting fentanyl with kind of your more normal street drugs, and the question is actually because it drives up addiction rates. If you were going for that to your dealer for cocaine, and it's cut with fentanyl, you're going to get a quote unquote better experience because it is like heroin in terms of. So a lot of the street dealers, particularly in America, are cutting cocaine, sometimes even weed, with fentanyl to drive up kind of return rates when it comes to the recreational drugs. I think, interestingly, or kind of quite horrifically as well, I think if you're a dealer, you probably don't care so much if people are dying or not, and it's causing a massive, particularly in the US, this is now the fourth wave of the fentanyl epidemic, but this is the first time that they're seeing it being cut with other drugs, and it's touching kind of every corner of the US.
Yeah. And of US deaths, I read, Cindy, 66% in 2021 anyway, which is the figures I was looking at, were tied to fentanyl. And yet, the Mexican drug lords seem to have a slightly laissez-faire attitude to that. Why the change?
Well, I think it's because it's become such a political issue in America. I was in San Francisco last spring, not spring this year, but spring last year. And it's incredible, the drug culture in that city where, as a tourist or someone coming in from the outside, the insider in San Francisco will literally say, do not go to these streets because it's so bad. And I know journalists have gone in there and just looked at the drug culture in America, and it is just because it's so highly addictive, and as Jamie says, sometimes it's cut with things that you don't even realize that you're on fentanyl for. So it's become a real political issue, and I know when it comes to the US relations with China, fentanyl is something that has come up, and China has just basically kind of said, talk to the hand about it, but even though production happens so much in China. But because of this political pressure, I think the Sinaloa cartel is thinking, we don't need that kind of laser focus. Let's just go back to this other stuff that, they don't care so much about, because this is just giving our business model a run for our money.
But for these guys in Mexico, Harriet, it's still the same deal. Like, why now? Why the shift in how they're treating this?
I think it's to do with the US indicting for the 4 Chapitos, the 4 sons of El Chapo, and loads of their associates. That only happened in August this year. And in September, Ovidio Guzman, who's the leader of the Chapitos and son of El Chapo, was extradited to the US. Now, as we remember from Pablo Escobar and the extraditables, it's the one thing that drug cartels really fear is extradition to the US. And with this indictment, that's become a real danger. But I do think that there are also rumors to be considered that they want to redirect some of the crackdown on fentanyl towards their rival cartel, which is the Jalisco cartel, which also produced a lot of fentanyl.
It's not a very subtle way of going about doing it, is it? Putting up a big poster in the town square.
But just because they've put up posters and just because there have been some kidnappings and a few bodies have turned up with blue fentanyl pills on them, that does not mean that this trade will necessarily stop for a long time. There are a lot of rumors that this is kind of more of a PR stunt and it won't really mean anything overall because, I mean, realistically, they're not going to leave this kind of lucrative trade to their rivals. They're just not. I mean, that's not going to happen. And to cover the losses in the short term, they might just end up doing more gun running, for example, or more heroin production or more cocaine and meth trade as well. So it could push the price of fentanyl up, which is actually still to the cartel's benefit. So it's a complicated issue here. Obviously, they do fear extradition, and everyone fears extradition to the US and the kind of prison that their father is in, and he will be for the rest of his life, is not something that any cartel wants. But equally, they do not want a rival cartel muscling in on their turf.
Okay, so that's in Mexico. I mean, in the US, though, Jamie, domestically, you were saying there seems to be increased awareness about fentanyl. What else can they do? I mean, are they doing enough to literally stop these industrial quantities of the drug coming over the border?
I think one of the big questions is how you stop it, obviously. And if you listen to the kind of Republican and kind of right-wing sentiment in America, a lot of it is like, we need to stop these illegal migrants coming in because they're carrying it. But when you read and look into the data, it's actually not really coming in through illegal migration. It's actually coming in through people who are legally allowed to travel, often US residents smuggling it in through the border. And so the question of how to kind of stop it coming in, I read a really interesting article about it in Foreign Affairs, which basically said that it needs to be more closer diplomacy, like greater diplomacy with the Mexican government, with the Chinese government. Basically, pre-2019, there was a real push to try and kind of normalize relationships when it comes to US, China, and the movement of synthetic opioids from China to Mexico and the US. But as Cindy said, they've really now got a kind of talk to the hand mentality, because it's broken down on a geopolitical level between Washington and Beijing. So there does need to be a kind of potentially from a US side a more holistic view on it, and not just like, oh, actually at the border we need to build a bigger wall or stop people coming in even more quickly.
Harriet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Mexico is becoming increasingly important to the US. It's surpassed China as their biggest trading partner this year. And in March, the president of Mexico, López Obrador, sent a letter to the president of China, Xi Jinping, calling the US pressure on fentanyl rude and basically blaming the US for the problem, but did ask China to cut back on exporting the synthetic opioids, which is very, very, very difficult to do, because they just the people who produce these opioids can just tweak the recipes and keep evading legal sanctions. But the Mexican president has also said that the fentanyl crisis is a US problem caused by a lack of hugs in US families, a loss of values, and their welfare crisis. And the US Secretary of State was actually in Mexico this month to talk about it. So this is a really, really, really big, tense issue now between these three countries that are all incredibly important to each other, whether in a very positive or a not positive way. So it's a real sticking point between three countries.
Cindy.
I think what's interesting is that, when you look at the relation between these three countries, Harriet, as you say, Mexico is a US ally. But in the last few years, especially during the pandemic, China has been pulling Mexico closer. And when it comes to, for example, vaccine diplomacy, Mexico was actually really struggling to get Western-made vaccines during the height of the pandemic, during that time when everyone was hoarding. And it was actually China that started exporting millions of Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines to Mexico in kind of goodwill gesture. And so I can see why Mexico is trying to basically tone down its demands to China. But, this is such a long-running issue, and I don't see any solutions anytime soon. I was interviewing the former Mexican ambassador to China recently, Jorge Guajardo, and he said that his first task arriving in Beijing in 2007 was to talk about fentanyl precursors, 2007, that was 16 years ago. And actually, he got nowhere with it until his president sat down the Chinese president eye to eye in about 2011 and said, we need to talk about this. But by that point, that government was on its way out. And so it kind of fell by the wayside. So it's just the length of which this problem has been going on, which has got worse in recent years, but it just shows that there's a lack of Chinese commitment to wanting to fix it. And, why should they? They have no game in this. Drugs are pretty much all illegal in China, and it's not something that concerns them for their narrow self-interested view.
And is it something that should concern the rest of us, Harriet, outside of the US? I mean, is this a burgeoning problem in Europe as well?
It absolutely could be. When the Taliban banned poppy cultivation last year, that was a really, really, really big moment because obviously the global heroin trade has been completely decimated. And one of the reasons that fentanyl is so popular is because it does a similar thing to what heroin does, but at a fraction of the cost and staggeringly easy to produce. It's not like poppies that need these big fields and time and cultivation. It's very difficult to do anything to crack down on it. And it's also worth thinking about just how devastating it is in the US at the moment. Cindy mentioned it kills more American adults under the age of 45 than guns, COVID, or cancer. I mean, we've seen tens of thousands of deaths in the US last year related to fentanyl. And that's to say nothing of all the people that died having fallen into poverty due to addiction or violence related to the drug trade or any other kind of side impact of drug addiction. And if we see a similar rise of fentanyl use in Europe and the UK, honestly, that could be equally devastating here.
And I think if we're talking about fentanyl coming over to the UK, Scotland, for example, has seen a kind of year-on-year record number of fatal overdoses between 2014 and 2020. It's now plateauing in terms of the number of drug deaths in the country, but there is, calls in America for these drug consumption rooms to take place. One of which is being trialled in Glasgow, and it would be interesting to see, because a lot of the problems in Glasgow come from the mixing of drugs. If we do get fentanyl over here, whether we do look at trying to tackle it through more things like that.
Yes. Okay. Jamie, you're up next after this. Okay, Jamie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it becoming harder to say, now that's what I call music?
And also, man, the reviews that come out at like midnight at night, it's like, what? You've listened to it once, just...
Marinade.
I don't... music reviewers, to me, I find like why 20 years ago, they're the gatekeepers, right? Because you have to buy a CD. You heard a song on the radio, totally. The music reviewers heard the CD before it's come out, so they go, this is good, this is bad. Nowadays, everything's streaming. Everyone's a music critic, therefore, like, the public can decide. Why are you going to listen to this dude? Go and listen to it. Just decide for yourself.
Yeah.
When these albums come out, like, it's good not to listen to people's opinions before you've listened to it. You got to decide whether you like the stuff yourself. Otherwise, you just turn into a sheep, you know?
Ed Sheeran talking to the Morning Mashup on Sirius XM. Now, that was in 2021, Jamie, but this issue of music criticism is back in the spotlight this week. What's happened?
Yeah, a couple of interesting quotes about music criticism this week. Ice Spice. Do you know who Ice Spice is, Ollie?
Was she the Sixth Spice Girl?
She was the Sixth Spice Girl, yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, she came in a freezer. No, she's one of the most preeminent rappers at the moment. She was on the Barbie soundtrack. But she said this week that she actually prefers listening to music critics because they actually study music and care about it. So I feel like I'd rather hear their opinion than the kind of faceless trolls that she gets.
Yeah, now I don't know who Ice Spice is, but I did see that being reported as a slam on Drake, and I know who that is.
You do.
What did Drake say?
So Drake got into a spat with another music journalist, his second in less than 12 months, when the journalist said that she was still waiting for a definitive Drake album. Basically, Drake responded being like, "Who is this? I've never heard of you. Your opinion is kind of worthless. And then she came back and said, we actually had an interview together quite recently. And he was like, oh, sorry about that. But he didn't actually apologize. So, but those spicy quotes came at the same time as two interesting long reads about whether there's a space for music criticism anymore as we used to understand it. So Tara Joshi was interviewed for Create, Define, Release, and she spoke about how the age of streaming and stan culture has meant that the medium has slightly fallen away a bit. She said that if music criticism was once a guide to what to listen to in a week of new releases where you might buy one album, now the terms are innately different when, thanks to streaming, we have access to all the new releases anyway, which is what Ed Sheeran was saying in the quote clip earlier.
And what does Jamie Timson say? Because you strike me as someone who, I'm going to put my cards on the table here, I'm going to bet that when you were a student journalist, you wanted to be a music reviewer.
Interesting, very interesting. No, I actually wanted to be a leader writer. I had far greater, loftier review. But I would tell people what I thought about music, and I definitely think there was a space for it. I guess the question really is, what. When we look at things like album reviews, and this week is a good example because the Rolling Stones album is out on Friday. I'm sure you're going to be a fan of that, Ollie. You know who the Rolling Stones are?
I've heard of them.
You've heard of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the papers are kind of full of like maybe 300, 400 word pieces talking about the Rolling Stones are back, and maybe going into kind of quite how youthful they sound considering their age. But that's kind of pointless, I think. Do we need an album review like that in our papers? Is it not more interesting to look at kind of longer form pieces about the culture and about what musicians are trying to say, rather than just like, oh yeah, the drums on this was really loud?
I mean, I've tried writing music reviews in my time. And Cindy, I don't know if you've ever tried in your writing to describe a piece of music, but it's actually really, really difficult to do.
Really, really difficult to do. I have this conversation with my boyfriend sometimes because he was a budding music journalist at university, and we dug up some of his old reviews recently, and they were actually quite good. And I actually don't think I could do that, as just someone who writes about, for example, China or politics. It's much easier to put into words what you're trying to explain there. But I think for music reviewers and for food reviewers as well, I think, it is a real talent to be able to describing words, something that you hear. And yeah, I would never deign to think that I could. I think music journalism is harder than political journalism.
So is there still a role for it? I mean, do you still look at music journalists when you're deciding what to listen to? Or is Jamie right that Ed Sheeran's right that maybe it's just not necessary anymore because we can all access it and say what we think?
I'm afraid I never really read music journalism because I always just kind of like bought the nice album covers, based it on that. And then now with Spotify, I just kind of get what the algorithm suggests.
That is how I used to buy video games, by the way.
But I think, I read Tara Joshi's article and I thought it was really interesting what she was saying, how some outlets that she used to write for, like Vice, have shut down. And I think that's a wider problem in journalism as a whole, that lots of people are not paying for journalism anymore. You're just going on social media to get your news. And so less established, more subscription-based outlets are struggling. But I also wondered if streaming is not also an opportunity rather than just an end to that business model. Because when you go on Spotify these days, and the platform has tried more to do this in recent months, I think, it does have some copy next to the artist names. And it does tell you a bit more about, this new artist that you're discovering. Someone must be writing that. So I wonder if, platforms are going into more of the editorialized...
Yes, ironically, music journalists are often writing that.
Yes, but obviously, I just mean like it's not the difference between Vice or Spotify. I wonder if Spotify would go down more of the kind of editorializing outlet view as well. And then the other thing is AI, of course, which I'm sure we'll get to, which raises the question about if any of us will be relevant in the future.
What, because you just ask a computer, what do you think of the new Drake album?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to writing...
And it will say, I'm on
when it comes to writing copy, I mean, are any of us useful in the future?
Yes. I mean, okay, Harriet, Cindy said a couple of things there. She compared it to food journalism, music journalism. I would say they're different in one way. I can see the similarity. Obviously, you're trying to describe something that's hard for consumers and that they need to almost filter through your context. Okay, but what's different is a food journalist is telling you, should you go to this restaurant in this town, which is going to take you, all night to go and do and get a babysitter and spend £100? Whereas a music journalist these days, and this is the difference, this is the point Ed Sheeran was making, a music journalist is saying whether or not you should stream for free a 3-minute pop song. In the time it takes to read the article, you could have done it and made up your own mind.
Yeah, see, I think this is a really interesting topic, actually. I went down a full rabbit hole reading about this and thinking about this.
Thanks, Harriet.
I personally, I love an album. I still love an album as a concept, as a one-off creation. And I do find it really interesting to read about that album's concept and about that album as a whole, as an entity. But I would say that streaming and the way we've listened to music has completely changed. I mean, like you say, if you're paying for an album that you're going to own, physically own, it's going to cost you 12 quid. It's going to take up space on your cupboard. You want to know, is it worth it? Is it worth my money? Is it worth my investment? If now you don't listen to music that way, then the role of the music journalist has changed. But I don't think that it's obsolete. There's so much more to say now about streaming, like emerging cultures, about the way that artists are now bypassing these traditional gatekeepers, about the way concerts have changed. There's so much intelligent, fascinating criticism that we need written. But the traditional, I mean, I just believe that cultural journalism has to adapt as culture changes.
Is it adapting anyway, though, Jamie? I mean, I presume if you are interested in pop music journalism, for example, there's plenty of options on Substack. They just might not be in the Daily Telegraph anymore.
Yeah, and I think, if you take Pitchfork as an example, it's like probably the biggest. It's owned by Condé Nast, so it is obviously still fairly mainstream, but Pitchfork it still does a lot of reviews, still has a lot of kind of taste-making credentials. The biggest critic there is a guy called Anthony Fantano, and he's kind of created a kind of cult following where it kind of goes off below the line, as they say, with a lot of people disagreeing with him and agreeing with him, and so I think it's probably just become a lot more niche, and I really do agree with what Harriet's saying in the sense that the journalism should just shift, and potentially there isn't really the space there for like, should I buy this album or should I listen to this album anymore? But there is a space for, what's going on in like, Milwaukee rap, or like what's going on in hyperpop, or like that is really interesting, and probably there should be a space in mainstream outlets for that as well. So while it is a kind of maybe potentially the end of an album review, there 100% still is a place for people that are interested in subsets of genres and being able to describe it well, because I actually think sometimes some of the best writing and some of the most interesting writing in journalism isn't always just about the most meatiest of topics. You get a lot of people who can write very well about seemingly quite small or insignificant things.
And also, I guess, an older audience too, Cindy. I mean, people mourn the fact that younger journalists aren't writing about their passions to a younger audience anymore because the younger audience is elsewhere. But for the older audience that are still there, there's that function that used to be provided by things like Top of the Pops, right? Where you just want to know what young people like. You want young people to explain it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And The Spectator still has a print music review section, which our most common music reviewer is actually Rod Liddell. That's very kind of controversial columnist for The Spectator, but actually he loves pop music, and I always enjoy what he has to read about.
Is he a fan of Ice Spice?
He hasn't reviewed her recently, but he did review Billie Eilish when her latest album came out, and I enjoy. I think Jamie's right. If it's good writing, if it's really entertaining, fun writing, then I think there is a place for it. But I think what we're seeing is like a wider problem in journalism as a whole, where people are not really paying for journalism, full stop. And so you feel like you need to know about current affairs, but you feel like you could probably cut out the music stuff. But there must be a way forward, because I hear what you're saying about the comparison to food journalism, Olly, and how it's not quite the same. But when it comes to these kind of non-political issues, food journalism still has a very big role to play in magazines these days, in books these days. Why not music journalism in the same kind of arenas? I don't think there's a good answer for that.
Do you have a favourite critic, Harriet, just to finish us off?
It's definitely not Rod Liddell. And to that note, I do think it's also...
You surprise me, Harriet.
I don't think that you have to be a great music knower to write really well about music, though. I do believe that just like anyone can write well about a topic they're passionate about and they do enough research on, or if they have a fresh, interesting take on it. But I do think that it's worth considering what critics actually pan. So some of the biggest things in pop culture and in music at the moment have been widely panned by traditional music critics. You know, these, generally speaking, older, generally speaking, white men who have panned massive cultural behemoths like previously Lady Gaga and Britney Spears and now Taylor Swift. And I think that it's worth considering how much of their own bias critics can bring to their writing and how much actually value there is to be opening that conversation to a wider audience.
But also bringing your own bias as a reader, Jamie. I mean, sometimes you choose a pop music critic. I'm thinking of like Kitty Empire, for example. I might read because I've read her for 20 years and I think, well, she broadly might like the same things as me. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, I think a lot of, well, certainly if we're talking about food criticism, there are a lot of cult writers, people like Jonathan Nunn, that kind of bring a massive kind of backing in terms of people that follow them because they like the food that he likes, or he writes about the things that they're interested in. And I think that's certainly true for music as well. And I think one of the interesting bits of that Tara Joshi interview, which I think Harriet is touching on as well, is that actually, like you say, is the gatekeepers have been white, you know, often middle class, upper class males, and not all music, which Olly, you'll be sad to hear, not all music is actually catered to the Top Gear generation. So I feel like we are opening it up to slightly. But hopefully we move to a situation where if people are writing about more niche subsets, it brings along more people for the ride.
Regardless of your age, ethnicity, social background or class, we welcome your reviews on Apple Podcasts. Do leave one for us. My thanks to Harriet, Jamie and Cindy, 5-star contributions all. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.